We're up to Daf Chav Tes, the Mishnah on the top of the Amud. And by way of introduction, when people buy and sell things, merchandise like wine in barrels or oil, then generally speaking, what happens is the mocher, the seller, has certain vessels that have a measurement of whatever commodity it might be. And then what happens is the mocher takes that barrel, which is well measured out, and he pours it into the vessel of the koneh, of lokeach, the one who's buying. And the Mishnah wants to know if that's permitted on Yontif. Of course, he's not going to pay him on Yontif. He'll pay him after Yontif, but he's already finalizing the deal on Yontif because, let's say, wine is paid, you charge someone per volume. Do you need something for your glasses? Or oil, the same thing. So what's called derech mekach umemkar, which means the way that you normally sell something in a weekday is prohibited on Yontif because it undermines the sanctity of Yontif. Omer Adam lechavero, the Mishnah opens up by telling us, in the name of the Tanakama, we'll soon see that Rabbi Yehuda's machmir, that you're allowed to tell the mocher, maleli kli zeh, I have a utensil, and I'd like you to fill it up to the top with wine or with oil, and that's what I'm going to purchase. I'll pay for it after Yontif. So then what happens is the lokeach points to a certain vessel of the mocher that has a specific measurement of wine or oil in it. He says, do me a favor, take the contents of this clay midah. Clay midah means it's a vessel that's used to measure, and pour it into my kelim, into my vessel. And then I'm going to take that and I'm going to acquire ownership on it. Avalo b'midah. Gemara is going to offer two interpretations to that phrase, avolo b'midah. It's a very ambiguous phrase. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im haya klichal midah lo yimalenu. The mocher is not allowed to take from a kli midah, which means the seller's vessel that has a specific volume that's marked off, and pour it into the kli, into the vessel of the lokeach, of the buyer on Yontif. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, that is already considered a Masechet. Masechet meaning it's derech mekach umekach. That's already indicative of a sale. And we don't buy and sell on Yontif. That's pogea, that undermines the sanctity of the Yontif. And now Rabbi Yehuda is going to prove his view from a story, from an actual event that occurred. Maisa Bi'aba Shol ben Botnis, one of the great scholars of that generation. And in addition to being a scholar, he was also a seller. Now, it reminds me of the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim had his own super mini market. He was careful to fill up all of his vessels that had a specific volume in them on Erev Yontif, and on Yontif, the lokeach, any buyer, would come in and he would pick up one of those vessels that were filled up on Erev Yontif, but to fill it up on Yontif itself, meaning to take a certain kli, and the mocher will say, and the lokeach will say, give me a full amount in that kli, or half of the kli, whatever it is, and then the mocher will pour it in, and then from there into the kli of lokeach. That's prohibited. That's derech Masechet. Abishol Omer. Now here you have to avoid confusion. Abishol is not the same as Abishol ben Botnis. Abishol is another contemporary at the time of the Mishnayos, and he wants to reject this proof from the story of Abishol ben Bitnis, which was quoted by Rabbi Yehuda to prove his shita. And he says the following: Af b'moed. Now the word moed here refers to cholo shel moed. Oseke. Abishol ben Bitnis would do the same thing on cholo moed, and he would avoid this whole business about klei midah on cholo moed for an entirely different reason. Has nothing to do with nira kemaisa chol kemek chumemka, because if that would be the case, then why is he avoiding this on chol hamoed? There must be something else, an entirely different element that motivates him to want to make sure that the night before the purchase, all the oil and the wine was already poured into the various vessels. And why did, according to this interpretation, Abishol ben Botnis do this? Mipnei berurei hamidos. Again, this has nothing to do with the Isur Yontif, because the Isur Yontif would not apply in Chol Hamoed. So we have to find another variable in the equation, and that's called berurei hamidos. Let's explain what berurei hamidos is all about. Now, let me preface that Abishol ben Bitnis, as the scholar in his generation in that particular location, was flooded with questions, halachic questions, that were brought to his attention on Chol Hamoed. Chol Hamoed is a time when A, there are a lot of halachic issues that come up, and B, when people are not going to work, it's a day off, so they have a chance, an opportunity to visit the rabbi and ask him questions. So that Abishol ben Bitnis was flooded with questions on Chol Hamoed. What was he afraid of? So in order to understand that, we have to add a word into the equation here that's called ketzet. Kuf sadi pei. I'll give you an example. My wife cooks a chicken soup. And if you've ever seen, there's like a film, a white film that rises to the top of the pot.
Fat. That's the fat.
The fat. So I'm just using that as a parallel, but I'm not talking about fat now. But in the case of wine, what happens is that when you pour fresh wine, there's a certain ketzef, it's almost like a foam that rises to the top. So you get the impression that the vessel is full to the top with wine, when it really is not. Because what happens is, if you wait a certain period of time, then that ketzef will sort of sink down and be absorbed into the wine. And then you'll see that there's a certain amount of wine on the top of the liquid wine in the barrel, and between that and the top of the barrel, there's no wine. But for that, you have to wait a certain period of time.
It's like foam beer foam. You pour the beer out, the foam is this big, then it drops down.
Excellent, excellent. Beer is a wonderful example. I'm not a beer drinker, but everybody knows that when you pour the beer, it's a foam that takes up, what is it? Would I be exaggerating if I said it's like 20%, 20% or more of foam? But if you wait a while, the foam will kind of die down, it'll dissipate, and then you'll see that you didn't give them the full amount of beer. So you pour in more beer to make up the difference. But the only trouble was that Shol ben Botnis was very, very preoccupied in Chol Hamoed. So in order to avoid that question, an issue in which his buyer would be cheated because they didn't wait around until the foam dissipated and filled up more to the top, he would make sure that he did this process the night before, anticipating that in the morning, the lokeach is going to come and buy. So he already on the night before filled it up, waited for the ketzef to go down. In the Hebrew version, he says, Lo haya bo lo t'nai bayom. He had not enough time, free time during the day. He was so preoccupied with answering one question after the other. Ad shetered v'sichaso v'yishka haketzef. Yishka milashon shkia. Shkia means to go down until the ketzef on top would go down. Nimtza. if he wouldn't have time to take care of that, Shalom Ismali Hakli, Lufi Amida should be Keish Halokeh. So Lokeh was asking for a full lug's worth of wine, and he was getting a lug minus 10% or whatever it was. And that's already a little bit of a chashash gezel, as if he's stealing from him. Lachain, therefore, hayanoig Abba Shol ben Bitnis, Lemalias Hakli, this Kli Mida, he would fill it up, Mea Erev, and then he would have plenty of time at night before the flood of questioners came in to see when would be the shkia of the Resichus. The Resichus, this Ketzer would go down, and then he would fill it up to the top. By the way, just by sheer association, this reminds me, in a contemporary life, you buy something and they tell you the volume on the outside. And then you open up and you see it's like all the way to the bottom. So they usually add an excuse that it sinks to the bottom. It settles to the bottom. Chacham go a step further in interpreting the story about the great scholar Abba Shol ben Butnis, and they say, not only did he do this on Chol Hamoed because he was preoccupied on Chol Hamoed with answering questions, but even a regular weekday, he had a problem which he had to solve by filling up the Klei Midah the night before. That was the solution. But what was the problem? Mipnei Mitzui Hamidos. So this is really interesting. Now, Mitzui Hamidos seems to be an issue with regard to oil, shemen. When you sell oil in a barrel, then what happens is the walls of the barrel absorb some of the shemen, some of the oil, so that what Shol ben Butnis did was he invited the Lekuchos already the evening before the sale to come with their empty vessels in which they wanted to buy oil, and the seller, in this case Shol, Abba Shol, he would fill up their kalim the night before with oil, because the oil would be absorbed into the walls of the barrel, and then there would be overnight a time period to wait until everything settled down, and they would see clearly by the light of day how much oil was the recipient actually receiving. And then Abba Shol would fill up to the top and make up for the difference of what's called Mitzui Hamidos. And now we start the Gemara. The Gemara says, what does that phrase mean? Avolo b'mida. The Tanna Kamma uses a very ambiguous phrase. And we're going to have two approaches here. We'll focus our attention on the first approach. That's going to take a while until we get to the second approach. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, what did the Tanna Kamma have in mind when he added these words, Avolo b'mida? Avolo b'kli hamiyuchad lemida. Now, what this means is the following: that there are two types of kalim. They're really one type, I'll explain in a minute, of klei midah, which the mocher uses to measure out in that vessel exactly the volume that he's selling. One is a vessel that's been used over and over again in the past. That's called a kli hamiyuchad lemida, that the mocher always constantly uses that vessel to measure out the volume that he's going to sell. There is another kind of a klei midah, which is called a kli ha'omed lemida. Rashi says, ha'omed lemida val adayin lo badad bo. Rashi points out that although it's up there in his closet for a rainy day, when for whatever reason he doesn't have another kli available, but he has never actually used it. So although it's omed lemida, it has all the lines, if you know what I mean, of a measuring cup, but it's never been in use in actuality. And that's called avolo b'mida, meaning all the requirements that we mentioned in our Mishnah on Yontif, And we restricted it to make sure that the lokeach would not, measure out exactly how much he wants. That applies to a kli amiyuchad lemida that's been used time and time again by the mocher, but not to a kli ha'omed lemida, which has not been used. And in that case, you're allowed to fill it up on yontif because it doesn't look like you're measuring it out. You've never actually used this kli. What we think is that the reason why he stretches his arm up to the closet and takes out this kli is we think because he doesn't have another vessel, but not because it's specifically earmarked for measuring, volumes that he wants to sell. He's just using it as a kli. He has no other way of transferring it over from the seller to the buyer. In those cases, he's permitted to fill it up in this kli since he's never actually used the kli as a kli mida. It's only a kli of omed lemida, but not miyuchad lemida. The Asa Rabbi Yehuda Meimar, and according to Shmuel's approach, his interpretation of Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda argues on this very point. Shafilu kli omed lemida lo yemalen. Even though this kli has never ever been used in the past for measuring, nevertheless, since it was created and manufactured and it is suitable and it is in the bullpen, if I could use that baseball term, ready and waiting to be used as a kli mida, therefore, since it's asu lemida and it's omed lemida, therefore, we're not going to use it on yontif. It looks like he's measuring it out in order to sell it the way he would do it during the week. So the Gemara now asks the following question. It's a question that has two sides to it. It's a double question. Alma, from our Mishnah, we conclude the following. Gabi Simchas Yontif, Rabbi Yehuda l'chumra v'Rabbanan l'kula. Let's start with the Rabbanan. We'll go backwards up the ladder. The Rabbanan, for the sake of Simchas Yontif, so that the buyers could purchase whatever wine and oil they needed for their table on Yontif to enhance their Yontif Suda, the Rabbanan were lenient. And for the sake of Simchas Yontif, they permitted the lokeach to come in to the mocher and say, you see that kli mida, pour those contents into my kli. That's what I'm taking from you on Yontif. And the Rabbanan are going to look for every loophole to say that it's not like a Masechet. This does not look like a sale. He's just bringing his kli, pointing to that kli and saying, pour it into my kli. Again, the Kamaisa, that's not considered a Masechet, and it's not Domo Lemekach. And why the Rabbanan being so lenient? Because what's at stake here is Simchas Yontif. We want to enhance Simchas Yontif. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda, he's more worried about Kedushas Yontif, not Simchas Yontif, but to protect the sanctity of Yontif, and we have to be very careful and strict and avoid any situation that might look like Mekach Umem. And therefore, since the lokeach is pointing to a certain kli, and he's asking for the wine in that kli, and that kli is a kli mida, once the mocher pours the wine from that kli mida into the vessel of lokeach, that's very near ke mekach umemken, that's prohibited on Shabbos. And Rabbi Yehuda's machmir, despite the element and the factor of Simchas Yom. So the Gemara says, we had a Mishnah on Daf Chav Ches. Again, that was yesterday's Mishnah, which you'll find online. Anyway, so in yesterday's Mishnah, we had a machlokes in the opposite direction, and that was with regard to selling b'mishkal, meaning if you sell something by weight on Yontif. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda is the makil. He's the lenient one. He says, shokel odom basar keneged akli. Let's say you have a kli, you have a vessel, and you happen to know the weight of that vessel. You're allowed to use that vessel in order to determine the weight of the meat, the basar that the lokeach is purchasing. Because you're not putting it on a scale. Normally, when you weigh something, you have a scale. So you put the meat on one side, and you have a scale with weights on the other side. He is using a kli as a weight, And Rabbi Yehuda says it doesn't look like Mekach Mekach. It's not the normal way. This is called a Shinu. He does it in an unusual way. Or, for example, Rabbi Yehuda's Mekil, Keneged HaKofitz. Kofitz is the butcher's knife. And they happen to know the exact weight of the butcher's knife. So they use it as a scale to weigh out the basar for the purpose of Lokeach, purchasing a certain specific weight of basar, because basar is sold by weight. And Rabbi Yehuda is lenient about it. Chachamim Omer, no, we're not going to allow this. Ein mashkichin b'kaf maznayim kol ikar. We don't care what you're using as a scale. A kaf maznayim is a scale. You're not allowed to weigh meat, no matter what you're using, whether you're using those weights, you remember those weights, or whether you're using something else that you happen to know its exact weight. We don't allow weighing on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, because it is pogea in Kedushas Yom Tov. And even though it's going to limit and restrict your Simchas Yom Tov, because you won't be able to buy this meat, nevertheless, the Chacham Amach is Almo. We see clearly from that Mishnah, Daf Chav Ches, the previous Mishnah, that Rabbi Yehuda L'Kula, for Rabbanan L'Chumra, is Kasher Rabbi Yehuda, Kasher Rabbanan the Rabbanan. In our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda is the Machmir. In that Mishnah, he's the Mekir. Isn't there a contradiction? And so to the Rabbanan, in our Mishnah, the Rabbanan are Mekil, and in the previous Mishnah, with regard to Shkilas Basar, the Rabbanan were Machmir. Says the Gemara to Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbi Yehuda Lokash. Let's take it one at a time. There's no contradiction in the two statements, the positions of Rabbi Yehuda. Hassam in the earlier Mishnah, where Rabbi Yehuda was makingly allowed you to weigh the basar against something that you know its weight, a vessel or a butcher's knife. That's b'she'eno omed l'mida, because you have a vessel that's not used as a measuring vessel. You happen to know accurately its precise weight, or the kofitz, but these are vessels that have their own purposes. That's not called a kli midah, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda says our Isser of Ma'aseh Chol on Yom Tov applies to a Kli Midah. These are not Kli Midah. But here, Kli Omed L'Midah. Why is this Kli look identical to a Kli Midah? It's got all the lines on it, like a measuring cup. And again, you haven't used it yet. Okay, fine. But it's definitely a Kli Midah. That's its essence. That's its purpose. That's what it's designated for. The Rabbanan, Nami Lokash. You can reconcile the two positions of the Rabbanan. Also, the Mishnah on Daf Chav Ches with Rabbanan Machmir. And it will not allow you to do Shkilas Basa, to weigh the meat for the purpose of buying and purchasing the meat on something which is not a scale, not normally used as a weight. Even during the week, if let's say you don't have available to you a Kli Midah, so if you have another Kli which has an exact weight, use it as a scale, and that's what you would do. It was common practice, and therefore, if you imitate that on Yom Tov, you are in effect weighing out meat for the purpose of sale, and that we don't allow on Yom Tov. Here in our Mishnah, the Rabbanan are going to permit the Lokeach to tell the Mocher, please take the contents of this Kli Midah and pour it into my key. The Loka of it moved in the Chol, because he's not doing it the way he normally does it. Why? Because he never used this Kli in the past as a Kli Midah. Although it was designated as such and manufactured as such, he had never used it. So in the eyes of the spectator, he's just using a Kli because he doesn't have another Kli. It happens to be a Kli Midah. Okay, this is the position of Shmuel to explain our Mishnah, Avalo B'Midah. Now, we're up to Roman numeral number 2, and that's Rava's interpretation of Avalo B'Midah. Rav Amar Mai, what does it mean, Avalo B'Midah? Shelo Yizkar Lo Shem Midah. That the Mocher and the Lokeach, in their interaction, should not utter the word Midah, meaning the Lokeach should not say to the Mocher, give me a log's worth of wine or of oil. Because once he mentions explicitly, he verbalizes the midah, that's already considered nirek Ma'aseh Chol. But if he doesn't mention the exact midah, then kli amyucha b'midah yimalenu. The Rabbanan are of the opinion we could be mekil, and we could allow using a kli midah and measuring out an exact amount and then pouring it from the kli midah of the mocher into the keli of lokeach, as long as they don't mention the word midah. It's a funny kind of halacha. The halacha is you got to be careful of what words you utter on your lips. Don't mention the word lug or chatzi lug or reva lug. Leave that out. As long as you leave that out, you have indicated you're doing it in an unusual way, because on a daily basis, when you bought and when you, let's say you purchased wine or purchased oil, you would always mention, give me a lug's worth of oil, a lug's worth of yain. And here's where Rabbi Yehuda's machmir. And Rabbi Yehuda says, also Rabbi Yehuda, I don't need you to mention the midah, the exact volume, and utter it on your lips in order to make this into a ma'aseh chol that looks like mekach umemkach. The very fact that you're measuring it out in a kli midah, it's irrelevant whether you whisper the word lug or chatzi lug. Alma, once again, the Gemara is going to go through the same shakla v'tari that we had before. We see clearly from our Mishnah that Gabi Simchas Yant Rabbi Yehuda L'chumra the Rabbana L'kula Ha'ibcha Shamina Le Tisnan. We have a Mishnah Daf Chav Ches Rabbi Yehuda Mishokel Adam Basar Keneged Akli Ukeneged Akofetz V'Chacham Omrim Ein Mashkich B'Kaf Bazayin Kol Iker. It's always asur, even though he does it b'shinui. And yet in our Mishnah, the Rabbanan are makil, they're lenient with a shinui as long as he doesn't mention the midah, and that itself is a shinui. Alma, we see Rabbi Yehuda L'kula, Rabbanan L'chumra Kasha, the Rabbi Yehuda Kasha, the Rabbanan. Says the Gemara, the Rabbi Yehuda Lo Kasha. Hasam, in that Mishnah where Rabbi Yehuda was matish kilas basa in a kli or a kofetz. That's be'eno miyuchad l'midah. Since that kli or that kofetz is not used normally for weighing, is therefore it's not at all similar to the way you would weigh it during the week for the purpose of a purchase. But hacha, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda's machmir, why? Because he's using a kli hamiyuchad l'kach. It's designated for midah, even though he hasn't used it in the past. But it's clearly, you can see it with your eyes. It's a kli midah. In the Mishnah Daf Chav Ches, where the Rabbanu were machmir and shkilas basar, even though it's al yedei shina uses a clear kofetz, deka av David ki avdid dechol, because even on a weekday, if in an event the mocher has no kli midah, he'll use another kli. If he knows the weight of that kli, it serves the function, the purpose of weighing the basar. But here in our Mishnah, the Rabbanan are makil, and why they lenient? Because in our Mishnah, keep in mind, Rabbi Yehuda says he didn't mention the word log. He never actually explicitly spoke about the precise measure that he wants, and that's enough for shinui to make it fundamentally, radically different than what he does during the week, and therefore it's mutter. The of the inish the makarve chamra the mana de kila. He says it's very common that if a person doesn't have another keli and wants to give someone else something to drink, so he'll use a kli midah, a measuring. A measuring cup is not inferior to any other cup, so that's what he'll give him in an event that he doesn't have a cup. So therefore, it doesn't look like, as long as he avoids mentioning, enunciating the midah, it doesn't look like an uvda dechol. And again, on Erev Yontif, he was sure to measure things out in the Kli Midah. So the Gemara says, no, that he did even on Chol HaMoed. Tana, we learned. After Moed Osakain, even on Chol HaMoed, he would do the same thing. And he would fill up the Midos on Erev, the day that he would sell it, the Erev before. Because again, he was such an outstanding scholar and he was so overwhelmed by questions in halacha on Chol HaMoed that he wouldn't have time to wait until the ketzev would go down so that he could fill in more yayin. So he took care of all of that the night before. We learned to the Beitza who, that means Abba Shol Ben Butnis. Kanas Shlosh Meos Garbe Yayin Mevirurei Amidos. Now, whenever you see shlosh meos, the number 300, that's a code word for what's called a guzma. If I want to tell you it's a large amount, I use the word 300. 300 barrels. So he had 300 barrels of wine that you could fill up these 300 barrels from the amount of wine that he saved himself because the buyers didn't have time to wait long enough until the Resicha would settle down. The Chaverov and some of the colleagues of Abba Shaul ben Botnis, Konsu Shloshmas, again, that exaggeration, Garbe Shemen, they could gather together 300 barrels worth of shemen, mimitzi amidos, from the amount of shemen that was absorbed into the walls of the casket or the barrel that was used to sell the oil, and the buyers never came back to demand that the seller make up for that amount, that volume of oil that was absorbed into the kli of the mocha. So what did Abba Shaul and his colleagues do? They felt very, very uncomfortable about the fact that they were left with such a large amount of extra wine and oil, which really wasn't rightfully theirs. I mean, it was never paid for. So what did they do? They came up to the collectors for the Hegdesh of Yerushalayim, and they didn't want to pocket it. I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you find coins and think maybe, somebody took it out of his pocket, and so you give it to the stock. You ever had that experience? Again, if it's $100, I don't know, you might think twice about that. But if it's small change, I put it in the pushka. You know what I mean? So what Abba Shaul would do is he would give all that extra surplus wine and oil, and he gave it to the Gizbar, and he told the Gizbar, you decide what you want to do with it. Amr Lahem, so the Chachamim said to Shaul, you really, according to the strict letter of the law, you don't have to do so. If the Lekuchos themselves, the buyers, did not wait until the Ketzef would go down or until they could determine how much oil was absorbed into the walls of the casket, then that's called Mechila. Mechila means I got most of what I want. I'm loyal the rest of it. I waive my rights. WAIVE. I waive my rights to the rest of the balance. But nevertheless, Abba Shaul ben Botnis and his colleagues, we don't want to benefit from that which really belongs to someone else. It's not gzela, with certainly al pidin, strictly according to the letter of the law. No one could sue us for theft, but we don't want to benefit from it. Amr lahem, Chachamim said, Hovech martem al atzmechem, since you took upon yourself this chumrah, as if to say that extra, that increment of oil is gezel, then asu mehem tzarchei rab. You know what? You don't have to bring it to the Gizbar of Hegdesh. Just designated for the needs of the public, which I thought, and what I'm telling you now is not correct, I thought he had in mind bridges. That the city, the municipality has to spend a lot of money on bridges so people can get from one island to the other. Like in New York City, there are bridges that connect the 5 boroughs. But the Gemara gives a different example. The Sanya we learned in the Beitza, Gazal v'eni yadei l'misha Gazal. This is, again, I mentioned before the Chafetz Chaim, he had a mini market. And on one occasion, he found out that the scales were not precise, but he had no clue how many people, which were the people who might have gotten ripped off as a result. So what he did was he took massive amounts of sugar and flour, whatever it was, and he put it out, and he made a public announcement. Anyone could come and take it. So he's hoping that those individuals who were cheated would come and get it and enjoy that benefit. Asu b'hem tzarchei rabim, ma'inidu what tzarchei rabim, Omer of Chizda, boros, sichin, umaros. These are various types of cisterns, subterranean diggings, which would collect the water so that there be enough water for the public to drink. Adberei Rav Chizda Rabbanan Ukva. What it means is Adberei, they used to go for walks together, different scholars. One would put his arm around the others before social distancing and Zoom, and they would discuss halachic issues. So in this case, Rav Chizda is talking to Rabbana Ukva in the streets of the city. Fidarashlo, and he presents the following halacha. Lo yimdad adam siorim v'yiten lifnei behemto b'yavchiv. Although you're certainly not allowed to measure out barley, which is Michael Behema for your animal, because that's already an act which we do, measuring out something for sales. It looks like Mekach Memkar. Aval koder hu kav o kabayin. What he's allowed to do is, if he has, let's say, a pile of barley, a stack of barley, he could take a kli, and he knows exactly how much of a volume that kli could contain, and he could dig it into the sa'orim. That's already enough for Shiva. And then no sin with Behemto, and he knows exactly how much he has to give to his animal. His animal gets a kav siorin on a daily basis. And that's what he does. But he does it in an unusual way. That's not the way you sell something, by digging into it. What you do is you take by hand and you pick up the siorim and you put it into the kli. That he's not allowed to do. And there's no problem. It's not derech b'dida. It doesn't look like mecham merka. It's not a ma'aseh, and it's mut. Further, another part of the drasha of Chizda is hanachtum. Nachtum is someone who, usually, by the way, in Shas, the word nachtum means a baker, a professional baker. Here, it doesn't mean that. The word nachtum has a generic phrase which is being used here. It's anyone who cooks for the public. He sells or provides for masses of people. And in such a case, the chef has to know exactly how many spices, in the ingredients, how much of spice he should put in. Otherwise, it's going to taste awful. It doesn't have salt. It doesn't have spices. So therefore, they were mativ for the sake of the rabbim, so that masses of people would ever enjoy the chef's cooking on Yantiv. Moded Tavlin, he's allowed to actually measure out in a measuring cup how much tavlin, how many spices he needs for this particular k'deira, so that there shouldn't be a kilkul and mess up the tam of the tavcha. And all the Mefarshim say, and there's Yushalmi to this effect, that medida mu'etes k'medidas tavlin, that when you measure small amounts like tavlin relative to the gigantic amount of volume of food that he's cooking, that's not considered a medida, but we're only going to allow this for nachtum, who's mavashal tzorcha rab for koshel shire b'lim limdom. He doesn't know how to precisely measure the amount of tavlin. Yesh chashash miyakdiach tafshilo. L'chein itiru lo chachamim aval balabayis. Right, the balabasta in her kitchen, Shema Vashel's liatzma, she's cooking for herself and her family. Ein chashashi akdiach tafshila. She knows how much, more or less, how many spices to put in, and she doesn't have to measure. Therefore, we're not going to allow it on you. Omar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, Omar Rav Modedes Isha Kemach Biyontim Nosenes Sofi Sasa. A woman is permitted, get this, to measure out the volume of flour that she needs to create an isa, a dough, which she's going to add water to the flour and knead the dough. And why would they so make it? Why would they allow medida, measuring, which looks like derech mekach memkar, on yontif, in the case of kemach, for an isa of the isha? Kidei shetito chala bi'ayin yof. Chachamim want 1/24 for chala, and which is about, shall we say, 4%? I'm just roughly rounding it off. You can do the mathematics. And they were afraid that if she didn't know exactly how much kemach, if she didn't measure it, she would say, just take a little piece and give it to the Kohen as challah, and she wouldn't give the full amount of ayin yafa that a good eye, someone who's magnanimous, would give 1/24. Shmuel Amar Asa. Shmuel says, no, we can rely on the women and they'll give the right amount. We don't have to allow medida of kemach for an isanya. So the Gemara asks for a Tana de Shmuel. There was a brisa that was brought by Shmuel to the attention of the Chachamim. And there it says mutter. The brisa explicitly allows it. And how could Shmuel therefore prohibit it? Amar Abaye hashtav di Amar Shmuel asur. Now we have a situation with Shmuel himself asking that it's also Vitana, and yet in the base Medrash of Shmuel they had a brisa that said it was mutter. So how do we reconcile this?